So I'd just like to introduce our intention for this evening. And narrative healing, as we see it, is the exploration of the illness and wellness continuum. And also, within the paradigm that exists in Western medicine, we see that most people have an illness perspective. And we believe that shifting to a wellness perspective would be beneficial in terms of creating a more fulfilling life for people, even if they have chronic issues. The other thing is that healing and curing are not the same thing. We can have a cure without full healing, and we can have healing without there being an actual cure. And that's something that we will be diving into in the course. We also see that healing, there's a dynamic nature to healing, and especially that it can happen on the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual levels. So a person can be considered to be healed physically, but there might be other aspects of them that need to heal as well. And the other thing is that we're dealing quite often with healing topics. It's very sensitive issues for the person that we're working with. So our level of capacity to be with difficulty is hugely important. And our outcome that we want when we're working with people is largely to build resilience and self-responsibility in them. And in this way, we will increase their quality of life hugely.
Thank you, Lois. And so what will unfold tonight in terms of a big picture view, there are 5 fairly large principles that we've found are important in a narrative healing setting. And we're really going to focus our attention on the last 2 tonight. But presence, awareness, and transformation, I'm sure many of you on the call could find ways to apply that in many areas, those 3 particular concepts. So we'll say a little bit about them, but we'll really zero in more on why narratives matter. And then also what we mean by a salutogenic orientation, because that is the orientation that we take in working with narrative healing. So again, these 5 principles: presence, awareness, transformation, that narratives matter, and a salutogenic orientation are really going to be foundational to the course. And we'll really dive in at some level to the last 2 this evening.
Okay. So we've made an assumption that given you're here this evening, that we have some common ground when it comes to these first 3 principles: presence, awareness, and transformation. That might be that we have a slightly different take on it and that we'd like to share. But in all coaching and in working with patients, our presence as a practitioner is hugely important. Creating awareness for the patient or the coaching client is vital, and we all hope for change or transformation or healing for them. So we have a focus on building capacity and resilience, and recognizing that people need to build capacity and we need to help them do that. We're going to encourage ongoing and dynamic living in people, and most of all, we want to increase their quality of life. And we recognize how difficult that is and how important it is to help people to achieve that.
Okay. Thanks, Lois.
All right. Now, our perception is that narratives matter greatly. The stories that we tell are an opening into what we believe, how we see life, and how we make the decisions that we make. And we also recognize that sometimes we don't, it's a subjective matter, and we don't really necessarily hear our own story clearly. So our role as practitioners is helping our patients or clients to hear their own story and understand how they're seeing things and how that may be challenging them, may be limiting them in some way, and helping them to open up that story so that they can see it more clearly and make different choices.
Yeah, and so what we found is that beyond the realm of narrative healing and narrative medicine and narrative coaching, lots of people are using story in ways that in fact are healing, even if it's not their intention. One example you see on the right side of the screen there is Mary Catherine Bateson, anthropologist many of you probably know of. And she has a wonderful essay entitled Composing a Life. She also has a book by the same name. And in it, she speaks about the value of having multiple versions of our life stories, not so much that one is true and one is false, but that depending on context and emphasis, at any given point in our lives, one of our stories can serve us better than other stories. And that's one of the things that we look at with the narrative healing approach, is finding the story that in fact serves us and doesn't limit us or in any way hold us back from our move toward healing. So there again, this language is, I think, very important, and the prospect of stories as healing is pretty expansive. It's new in some ways, but it's really not new at all. I would argue it goes back to the Bhagavad Gita in certain places, but that's another context. So we've also wanted to focus in on this idea of an illness versus a wellness narrative. An illness narrative is one that's going to talk about something's wrong and it needs to be fixed, or this has happened because of somebody else or something that happened to me. Whereas a wellness narrative is going to allow us to move more fully into how can I move myself better, rather than just blaming or trying to fix something. And the stories can be personal or they can be extraordinarily huge, whether it's in a community, in a country, on the entire planet. And two really wonderfully powerful examples of the difference between an illness and a wellness narrative are the differences between what we refer to now as ISIS and some other names, a group of folks that are misrepresenting Islam, killing innocent people in the name of perceived injustices. That's a narrative, and it's definitely an illness narrative. It's one that points a finger of blame, isn't trying to make anything better or move toward health or healing. One of the most, for me, fascinating real-life examples of a healing narrative or a wellness perspective is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Not that the move from apartheid to democracy was bloodless, but it was remarkably peaceful if you look at it in a pretty big perspective. And that's what we mean by a wellness perspective or a healing narrative. They found a way to tell a story that moved the health of the country forward, rather than kept them divided and in kind of an illness place.
Thanks, Reggie.
Yeah.
So moving from a more global to a personal perspective, the quotations that we've chosen on the right-hand side of the screen are indicative of wellness perspectives. And having a wellness perspective isn't just putting on a set of rose-colored glasses or just believing that it's all going to be different because you've just changed your belief system. It's really getting in and having a very clear look at what's going on, getting real about what's happening, but also real about what your possibilities are, and recognizing that because you have a limitation in one area doesn't mean that you can't have a full life. Okay.
So we've referred to the word salutogenesis or salutogenic several times so far, and for some folks it might be a new word, for others it might be familiar. But literally it refers to the creation of health. It comes from saluto, meaning health, and then genesis, meaning origins. And we're contrasting it with what we would argue is the conventional Western medicine model, which is pathogenic, which emphasizes finding out what's wrong, diagnosing, and treating it, fixing it, curing it. If we take salutogenesis and pathogenesis and look at them together, we're looking at it, what John Travis has called a wellness paradigm, which seeks to move the individual's state of well-being further along toward optimal states, whether they be physical, emotional, or mental, and not so much just worry about fixing what's wrong. And we'll take a closer look at that in the next slide. So you can see these two models, saludogenic and pathogenic, juxtaposed with each other.
All right, so when we look at these with the pathogenesis and the saludogenesis juxtaposed with each other, we're not suggesting that it should be one or the other, that we should get rid of the pathogenic, that they can both work together. Because for instance, if you break your arm or you have a heart attack, the pathogenic existing methodology works extremely well. But if I consider, for instance, a heart attack victim, valves can be replaced, hearts can be replaced, and they've gone through that part of the system, but that person might still be afraid to live. So the saludogenic perspective would be hugely valuable to them at that point, whereas they could learn how to live their life fully in spite of the fact that they've gone through this huge event in their lives. They could build the capacity to do the things that they want to do and have the life that they wanted. So they can, but you can see that there's a dichotomy in the pathogenesis view where you're either sick or you're not sick. And in the saludogenic view, you're on a continuum of health and disease, and wanting to move yourself further along to the wellness perspective, and that you have the capacity to do that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lois.
All right. So in the course, and all of our courses, we're using the cycles of learning perspective. So, and recognizing that a shift doesn't usually happen just all at once. And so we are using this cycle to build by revisioning what happens. So we would start out with the initial narrative, the initial story of what's happening. And throughout the course, by reflecting and having observation and reflection from us and from the other members of the group, we would be able to change and revision the story over time so that you will be getting the result that you want, something that's more supportive of you than possibly the story that you're telling right now.
So moving forward then, from those cycles of learning, one of the core concepts in the healing narrative, and this comes from Aaron Antonovsky, who actually was an Israeli-American sociologist, born in Brooklyn. He passed away, I believe, in 1994. He actually coined, or is credited with coining, the phrase saludogenesis. And in his work with healing, he identified what he referred to as the sense of coherence. And it's actually a wonderfully powerful tool. I first came upon it, some of you are familiar with John Kabat-Zinn, and Kabat-Zinn referred to it in Full Catastrophe Living back in the early 90s. But for any one of us to have a really grounded sense of coherence in our lives, or with any kind of grief or loss or trauma, there are three components. The first one is comprehensibility. And that can be stated as simply as, I understand this. I can make sense of my internal and external experience. So that's usually an initial step. A second step is manageability. So once I understand it, I feel I can work with it, whatever it happens to be. And I have the available resources to meet and manage whatever it is I'm facing, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, whether it's a combination of those, spiritual even. And then finally, with comprehensibility and manageability, the odds of being able to find some meaning, that this is meaningful to me, I can find meaning in it, and I can commit myself to whatever I need to do to move forward. Again, Antonovsky referred to those three components as a sense of coherence. And we've found in our respective work with our own healing narratives that's, not to be presumptuous, but Antonovsky definitely got it right. The idea of something being comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful definitely leads to a sense of coherence. So it's a really powerful tool that I know I rely on personally, and I know that Lois and I and Joel and some others have used quite extensively.
All right. So one of the principles that we brought up at the beginning was transformation, which we see as a perspective shift, which changes behaviors. And chosen the idea about this not being confined or defined by what has happened, that we do have choices, but sometimes there's a need to help people understand what those choices might be. We've chosen this particular picture as an example. This is from Dancing with the Stars a couple of seasons ago. And the fellow, Noah, was a soldier in Iraq. And as you can see, he lost both of his left arm and leg. And when he came back from the war, he was disabled. And he obviously made a choice in his life to make things different, to not be completely defined or confined by what had happened to him. And he put himself in a position that most of us that have all of our limbs would probably not, in a dance competition. And he came in third. And so he's a really good example of what we're talking about here, which leads into the next point about relationship, is because his dance partner, his instructor, was hugely important in helping him to understand what he could do and to recognize the limitations that his body offered him, but also the possibility of how he could use what he does have. So recognizing the challenges, but also recognizing the strengths that we have is a huge part of the narrative healing process. And in relationship, who we are, how we are, is hugely important as practitioners, because we cannot offer people what we don't have for ourselves. So recognizing that we are in it with them when we're working with people, but we also have to be able to give ourselves the compassion, the empathy that we want to be able to offer. So we really need to do this work ourselves first in anything that we're working with people like this. So we think it's really important, if one is going to do narrative healing with patients or clients, that they experience that for themselves first, so that they have a really good understanding of what is happening, so that they can provide the kindness, the humanity, and the mindfulness from a very solid, very present place. And these quotations from Kristen Neff and from Albert Einstein are representative of that. Okay. Right?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Okay, so we are going to now just take a little bit of time to show you how this process works, to give you a little bit of a feel for it. Reggie has very kindly offered to share his experiences with us this evening. So I'm going to ask him a few questions so that you can get a feel for what this narrative healing experience is like. So, Reggie, are you ready?
I'm as ready as I could possibly be, Lois.
Okay. So what I'd like to find out first is, what was it like for you to write your healing narrative?
Yeah, that's such a broad question. I'm going to come at it from two ways. One is, I was writing a healing narrative before I knew that that's what I was doing. I mean, I like to joke that the first one I ever wrote was when I went home after my high school principal, my junior year, assistant principal, told me he was going to throw me out if I didn't cut my hair. And I went home angry and upset, and I wrote for about 2 hours. Some years after that, I wrote a book about my experience getting cut from basketball teams and then becoming a coach, which really reconciled my experience. In hindsight, that was a healing narrative as well. But more to the point of your question, since I've been doing it more consciously, both through poetry and prose, what it's like is both exhilarating and terrifying. It takes me into dead ends and to broad openings. It's a process that isn't particularly predictable, but there are certain tactics and strategies I've found that work better than others. And people like James Pennebaker and Lois MacNaughton have proven that there are certain strategies and tactics that work well too. So it's a wide open process. There's not one right way to do it. But there probably are some better ways to approach it.
Okay. Good, thanks. So what have you learned about how you heal through doing this process?
Yeah, so I've learned that getting the words on the page for me is the beginning of a healing process. And in fairness, I have to admit that writing is one of 5 ways that I've learned I can really heal. The other 4, let's see if I can do this, are wandering in nature, having intimate conversation, physical exercise, and meditation. I think that's 4. But the combination of those 5 modalities, the 4 other ones as well, they complement each other. There's a synergistic relationship there. And the writing is, for me, very often the place where they can come together, where I can process. Nobody gets to see it until I'm ready to share it. And I can make a mess of it. I can delude myself if I want to delude myself, and then I can realize I'm deluding myself and try to get more clear. So it's a wonderful process, and it's also somewhat vulnerable and difficult.
So it sounds like you've learned a lot about your challenges as well as your strengths.
Oh yeah. Not that I have any challenges. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So what was it like to have other people read and respond to your narrative writing?
Yeah, and I'll qualify that too, because I've been writing for years, and I have several books in print, so I like other people to read my writing. So for me, it's not. For many of us, writing is kind of a scary thing to do, because somebody told us years ago we weren't any good at it, and then it's even more terrifying to share it. So I don't have that particular fear of sharing my writing. But having said that, when I've shared the healing narrative parts, and some of the healings that I've done have been the loss of my parents. I was a caregiver for 3.5 years. My sister took her own life in 2009. And then my marriage ended in 2013. To share that kind of healing in writing with others is a little bit more vulnerable. That's a lot more vulnerable. But what I've learned is if you share it in a safe place with trustworthy people, it's almost inevitably healing and beneficial to go there, because the sharing of it amplifies the writing. It's one thing to feel it or think it. It's another thing to write it and see it on the page, and then to make it public makes it even more powerful, in my experience of that. So I think I answered your question.
Yeah. Did any of the reflection of others alter your perspective?
Yeah, good question. Yes, and primarily when someone saw or heard in my writing something that I either that I didn't intend, or that I did intend, but they had another take on it. So a different perspective. Not that I would necessarily have to agree with what they saw or read, because we all get to bring our perspectives to what we read. But often there was an expansion and a new knowing that came from others' reflections on what they read when they gave me feedback on it, or responded to me. So yeah, it can be expansive. And if it was something that I really couldn't see yet, or I felt they were wrong, that was okay too, because I could just ignore it.
You had options.
Yeah.
So I'm also curious about how having written a healing narrative supports you when difficulties arise now.
Okay. And if I could, I want to just really speak to it. When we say writing a healing narrative, for me, it's something that I don't finish. I might finish a chapter of it. I'm dealing with this issue, and after X number of weeks, months, or even years, I feel like I've gotten through that to a certain extent. But my ongoing writing with poetry and essays and different things, it for me is an ongoing narrative, even if it seems to be in chapters or different editions and revisions. It supports me because having done it for a long enough period of time, not that that's necessary, but I believe I'll be okay. Nowadays, when something uncomfortable happens, and I could be wrong. I mean, my belief could be mistaken. I don't think it is. But okay, I really believe that there is no ultimate security, there is no ultimate control, and that no matter what happens, I can be okay with it. Some things are more challenging than others. Having lived through and written through various iterations of a healing narrative really helped me be okay. I'm saying be okay. I know that given enough time, everyone dies. So I know I'm not, I've gotten past the invincible immortal thing from adolescence. And I'm going to be okay as long as I'm alive, and perhaps even after that. But I don't know really for sure about that part. Yeah.
Remains to be seen.
Yeah, we'll see.
Okay. So I've got one more question. And
sure.
It is, how has this work influenced your coaching practice?
That's actually, it's given me a perspective on clients. I won't say that, not that I didn't have, but it's probably deepened a perspective that I had at some point. Because I actually believe that this sounds self-serving or even webinar serving, but it's really not. Because I said this to a group of people, and you were in the group, 4 years ago, when I made a decision to join a group called Coaching and Healing. And I joined the group because I thought that all of the other choices, that all of the topics were healing topics. I think that anytime that I've ever gone to a coach or a therapist or talked to a close friend about something that was important, it was about healing something. And so when I work with a client, whether it's somebody who wants to make the next pay grade, somebody who wants to stop taking naps in the middle of the afternoon, or somebody who wants to be a better leader at work, my take on that, even if I never say it, is that something needs to be healed there. And what I'm really doing with the client as I'm working through their topic and having conversations and watching them work through practices is that it's a healing conversation, even if there's not something that they would think needs to be healed. So it's just tweaked my perspective. Again, I don't force the language of healing on anybody, but it's more just my perspective has shifted with my clients.
Very cool.
Right. So that's my story. That's my narrative, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay.
So thanks for that, Lois.
Well, thank you.
Yep. And so what we'd like to do now is just going to move back into to take what I've just shared and really move into what we'd like to speak a little bit about next, and not for too long, but it is part of why we're here, is to speak a little bit about the course itself. And Lois, do you want to just kind of jump in on the left-hand side there to get started, to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Okay. So these are the things that you would receive or gain a benefit from coming into the course, is that it is a proven approach. This is something that we've actually been working on with Joel and with 7 other people in the coaching and healing group for 4 years, developing this perspective and working with it ourselves and working with other people. So it's something that we know works. Within the course, as I mentioned before, you're looking at a direct experience of the narrative healing because you go through your own process so that you understand it fully. We will dig very deeply into why narratives matter. And you'll learn that from looking at your own narrative and how you change it. The process of sharing the narratives would happen on a forum. There would be a certain amount of that in the actual course time, but being able to share and reflect and seeing how other people are dealing with what's happening around their own narrative is hugely expansive as well. The other thing is our impact as either a doctor or a coach or any other kind of healthcare practitioner, is the importance of who we are in that space and how we can hold the space for the other person to learn about themselves and make change is hugely important, because the relationship itself is actually the fuel for that change. And in terms of it being a proven approach, we have learned that we really can facilitate a transformation by using this process. And I guess I've actually looked at being empathetic with people as part of our presence, but being with the discomfort of others is a huge step. Being able to be with it even when you can't do anything, to be with them and to help them come to terms with what they can do, it's a huge gift.
Yeah, thanks, Lois. And I'd like to just speak quickly to a little bit of the logistics of the course, and I'm going to just change the screen for a moment here and share with you. We use a Moodle platform online, and we just finished a course that Joel Kreisberg, our executive director at Teleosis, taught, called Designing a Client-Specific Coaching Plan. And right now you're looking at that. If I did that correctly, you're looking at the Moodle platform. And over here on the left-hand side, there's a navigation pane where you can go in and navigate through different parts of the course. But just to see, there's a welcome page. There's a week 1, creating a healing topic. There's a week 2. And the actual online forums, there are some forums up here now. So I'm going to show it to you quickly, but to respect the privacy of the students that are there, this course ended. But so you can see what it looks like. When we do writing online, it appears on a page something like this, and I'm just going to go really quickly. People write what they write, and then you can respond to it and engage. And I hesitate to use this language, but it's kind of like if somebody puts something on Facebook and then you write comments. It unfolds that way, but it's nothing like Facebook. It's private, and it's actually very accessible, and it's a pretty solid tool. So this is the forum the platform that you actually use for the classes. It's Teleosis's platform on Moodle. So we will be using that for the course. And just to say as well, as I'm speaking about that there's another iteration of the designing a client-specific coaching plan coming in March, on March 15th this coming month, with Joel again teaching that class. But back to where we are here. I think it's important just to note again that the online forum allows for a really intimate exchange of ideas. This class, for those of you who are ICF coaches, has been approved for 12 continuing education units, and it's offered now until it begins at $100 off the original price of $395. 4 Wednesdays, March 2nd is the first one, March 23rd is the third one, and it ends, it goes from 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's actually, I believe, a misprint there. It says 4 p.m. Pacific time, but it actually begins at 11 a.m. Pacific time, not 4 p.m. So that's incorrect. I'll take the hit on that one. So with that, I think that what we'd really like to do next is open up the floor to questions and see if anybody has anything they'd like to share with us.
Want to give instructions on raising hands and things like that?
Yeah, I did that at the beginning. Probably need to do it again in terms of if you're on the. I'm going to end the share screen here in just a moment. Down at the bottom of your screen, there's a participants button. If you click on that, you'll see an opportunity to raise your hand in the lower right-hand corner of that, and we will listen to your questions as they arise. So does anyone have a question?
Or are we just that clear?
There's one. We have Jim has a question.
All right, thank you, Jim.
Hi, Joel. I'm not sure it's what your question is. Well, maybe it is. I worked before on poetry a bit. For me, that was a new thing. And what I really learned was that I could actually write something as a poem that I could never actually journal as a prose narrative. So when we talk about healing narratives, is it, I think the question is how many different varieties do you see out there? It can't just be about writing a piece of prose or just having a verbal story, right?
Yeah, so I'll address that first. So I agree 100%, Jim. In fact, my narrative work is, and again, narrative, I'm glad you asked that question, doesn't just mean prose. And probably more than half of mine comes through poetry. So that's a really good point. And we don't dictate how you write it. We provide the opportunity for writing a healing narrative. But the genre, if somebody wants to do it in a dramatic play or a screenplay, or whether it's poetry or prose, an essay or blog, I think that all of that works. So I think I'm grateful that you mentioned that. It's definitely not based on writing complete sentences in correct grammar. That's not required.
Actually,
if you want to publish it, maybe, but beyond that, no.
And actually, we don't even offer a template for how one would even start doing it, because it needs just to be an expression of what's going on for each individual. And so there is really no right or wrong way to do it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Lois. And thanks, Jim, for that question. And did we add to your question?
Yes, you did.
Okay, good. Always happy when I actually hear the question and answer it directly. Anyone else? Questions about narrative healing in general, about the course itself, about anything that we mentioned over the course of the webinar so far? Feel free. So what I'd like to do, we'll keep the opportunity for questions is still up, but I'm going to share screen just one more time to take a look at the nuts and bolts again of the course. So I want to get that up there for you.
There's a question from Anna coming up too, if you want to.
Okay, so let's just go ahead. Anna, take the question. Your question is more important than any screen I might share.
Hi, everyone. So my question is, when working with clients, do you find that somehow they don't realize that they have a narrative and that it's actually what's affecting their situation?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, in us saying that people have an illness narrative is that they don't really recognize that they have a story at all. because it's very subjective. It's just what is. So they're not questioning it up front. So shining a light in around what's actually going on allows them to see that they are telling a story.
Yeah, that's a great question too, Anna. And because we always, all of us have a story, whether we know it or not. So part of what we're able to do is if someone believes he or she doesn't have a story, he or she doesn't have a story, we're able to say, well, I think you might have this, your story is that you don't have one, and we want to explore that. Because it's all story one way or another. So that's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Did we address what you asked?
Yes.
Good.
Reggie, Jim, I noticed Nancy, you said to sign off, but you'd actually a question in the chat room you might want to look at.
Okay, sure, we'll take a look at that. So I'll just actually read the question outright. I did a training in Pennebaker model. James Pennebaker is probably the primary researcher on using expressive writing for healing for the last 30 years or so. She did a training with Pennebaker and John Evans, and they worked together and had other trainings using her own writing. I'm interested more in using learning, using learning more and getting more experience guiding others in the writing. What advice do you have for me? We'll check in with you tomorrow. Thanks very much. So let me address that too. So she's interested more in using learning and more and getting more experience guiding others in the writing. So what we're going to do, first of all, with this class, what we're going to do is model that. I mean, what we'll actually do in the 4 weeks is model how to use this with clients and or patients. Having said that, I mean, she mentioned, I mean, look, Google James Pennebaker and John Evans for sure. Take a look at Louis Mel Madrona. Look at what John Fox, there's a bunch of Foxes out there. John Fox did with poetic medicine. There are quite a number of great resources. I'm not going to think of them all off the top of my head right now, but there is a lot more out there for learning how to work with narrative, whether it's poetic or prose. So thanks for pointing me to that chat question, Jim. Yeah. So anyone else? We're coming up with about just 2 or 3 minutes to go here. Kate, go ahead. Can we unmute Kate?
I'm unmuted.
Great.
I'm really curious about the method for getting into the story. Like how you actually, and this may be answered in like take the course, but I'm curious about the entry point of getting at someone's story. How do you go about that?
Go ahead, Lois. Do you want to go there?
We start with the exploration of a healing experience. And it's an entree into what the story is about healing. It's usually not a very full story, and it requires exploration. But it just begins with something that has happened. And then that takes us to what do we know about ourselves.
Okay. And I assume that there is an explanation of what a healing experience is, that there is a, because I'm imagining that for every person there is a definition.
That they have their own.
Of what a healing experience actually is, and whether or not you can actually think of one.
Yes, yeah, and we've all had them in different ways, and sometimes it, especially for people that have not had any significant issues. It was even for myself. I had to search around to find something to actually work with. So no one person is like any other. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's partly where the relationship helps in terms of guiding and asking questions and finding out what's going on. And so things that we wouldn't necessarily think about ourselves.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And so we have time for just, I think, one more question. I think is Jim's hand up again, or is that an old hand from a previous question?
No, that's to new. And actually, what I wanted to do is support what Lois and you were just saying. Because Reggie and I had an experience for me that wasn't necessarily about this, but led to it. In that I expressed a series of events that had happened to me in my life, like their point forms. And Reggie, in a phenomenal, almost single sentence, turned that into really trying to understand an experience that was hugely important to me, that led me to actually dealing with something that I didn't know I even actually had to deal with. So it can start from a very small beginning and lead to something that's quite phenomenal. I could give you the details, but it's just the personal stuff, right? But it was really, really good for me.
Okay. Thank you.